Hello, everyone. Can everyone hear me in the back? Yeah? Okay. I'd like to welcome everyone in the room to e-flux this evening for a lecture with Robin van der Akker and Timotheus Vermeulen, entitled 8 Theses on Covfefe. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Nobody knows. In this lecture, Robin van den Akker and Timotheus Vermeulen discuss Donald Trump's Twitter typo, roughly pronounced as Covfefe, no one knows, and its oft-cited relations to post-truth discourses, outrage culture, and postmodernism in the context of a possible world theory. It is said that every proposition requires a world. A fairy tale needs a world in which there are elves or talking teapots, just as the study of physics needs to assume the existence of the Higgs boson. What worlds do Covfefe and its correlates, such as alternative facts, zero contact, biggest ... reform, require? What customs or properties do they need to assume? Who lives there, and in which circumstances? What can happen? What is necessary? What is conspicuously absent? This lecture analyzes these questions to ask, what worlds are we living in? By way of introduction, Robin van den Akker is lecturer in continental philosophy and cultural studies in an academic program coordinator of the Humanities Department at Erasmus University College in Rotterdam. He is founding editor, alongside Tim Vermeulen, of the research platform Notes on Metamodernism, which maps and analyzes changes in aesthetics and culture that are symptomatic of the post-postmodernism condition. As a member of the Dutch Philosophisch Elftal, this must have a proper pronunciation, yeah. The national team of philosophy, he has a regular column on current events in the daily newspaper Trouw. Tim Vermeulen is associate professor in media, culture, and society at the University of Oslo. His latest book, Metamodernism, Historicity, Affect, and Depth After Postmodernism, co-edited with Robin van der Akker and Alison Gibbons, was published by Rowman and Littlefield International in 2017. Please join me in welcoming Tim Vermeulen.
Yeah?
Are you doing an introduction?
Yeah, I'll talk a bit, yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Shall I speak in the microphone, this one? Thanks so much, Brian, for having us over and organizing this, setting this up. Also, Amal and everyone else. Thanks for the crowd to come over. It's so kind. So, Robin and I will be talking about this particular tweet, which I am imagining we are the only people still concerned with, right? I mean, I think there is something like a Trump fatigue, but also I think there is a sense in which there are so many of these kinds of tweets and there's so many of these kinds of statements that we tend to move on and move on and move on. And I don't know if it's a disclaimer. It is a disclaimer, but it's more than that. I think we are very slow thinkers, but also I think it's necessary in times where everything seems accelerated all the time. I don't believe that we should accelerate stuff further. I think we should slow things down. And I think we both feel that we should slow down stuff. And we should take stock of some of the statements that are being made. That would go beyond simply stating this is fake or this is fictional. This doesn't abide by the rules of truth or of facts or of reality that we have hitherto used. I think it might be quite useful to begin analyzing, to begin to try and map out the very particular fictional structures that are at stake here. And so what we will try to do is make a beginning, a very haphazard and very uneven beginning, in trying to map out just one single tweet, which is this typo, Covfefe, which I think is in a way symptomatic for the larger output that we're dealing here with. And so the first disclaimer is that we are concerned with something many people have forgotten or have wanted to forget. The second, in this sense, is that it is an incoherent or rambling talk. This is something that we're just beginning, and which is why we're so excited to do this today. We're just beginning to think about this, about the notion that fiction could be a new method for many people, both in politics and in the arts and in different kinds of fields, structure or to map out, to chart out what reality may mean for us right now. And so it's uneven, and we have chosen the format of the thesis, of 8 different theses, you might say, because we will talk about Covfefe as a game, as a particular kind of gameplay. So you might say these are the rules of the game that we're trying to outline in a way. But it is uneven. So we're jumping between different arguments, different kinds of points on a map, rather than giving the contours of something. And then finally, it may be good also to say that we will talk about possible worlds to an extent, but we are not philosophers of logic, and we know nothing of mathematics or mathematical structures. And so we come to this, I think, from a kind of naive position in a way. And so we'll begin to think with this more as a thought experiment than anything else. And I think that those 3 disclaimers are important. And I think hopefully they'll also be exciting. So yeah, that's as a way of introduction.
Okay, so we're going to go through 8 theses. So in a sense, we're following also the numerical logic of a clickbait site, right? Board Panda. But we have 8. Number 1. Covfefe alludes to a popular game, hot or not. And we're going to read out pieces, and some pieces we're going to improvise, so bear with us if that form is annoying you, but I think it's the best we can do now. In the fictional worlds that are structured around Covfefe, there's a lot of heat and not a lot of light. These worlds are hot and dark places, so many circles of hell, you could say, in which the winners have the skills to game the central operating system that goes by the name cybernetics. Let me briefly explain this point by taking you back to Facebook's origin myth. The story is well known. Zuckerberg created, coded, hacked the software for a website called FaceMesh from his student dorm room. Socially isolated and abandoned by his girlfriend, he wanted revenge on anyone who failed to recognize him as well. A great guy, a peer, if not their superior in many respects. That night, as Claire Hoffman reported in a portrait for Rolling Stone, Zuckerberg wrote, slightly drunk, on his blog, "I'm a little intoxicated, not gonna lie. The Kirkland dorm Facebook is open on my desktop, and some of these people have pretty horrendous Facebook pics. I almost want to put some of these faces next to pictures of farm animals and have people vote on which is more attractive." And an hour later, yeah, it's on. I'm not exactly sure how the farm animals are going to fit in to this whole thing. You can't really ever be sure with farm animals, but I like the idea of comparing 2 people together. Rating fellow students, hot or not, can obviously be seen as a precursor to YouTube, thumbs, Instagram hearts, Twitter likes, and so on. And yes, also Facebook's like button, the most successful of such rating functionalities. FaceMesh proved very popular. The next day, hundreds of students registered to rate their fellow students. Hot or not, hot or not, hot or not, hot or not, times 22,000. The rest is history. The story of FaceMesh encapsulates all that is wrong with the cybernetic culture that consists of echo chambers filled with feelings, opinions, trolling, and outrage, facilitated by software companies playing fast and loose with our personal data. Yet it also foreshadows today's unfortunate death of the expert, say a journalist, a scientist, or a critic, and the loss of a shared ID, and this notion of shared is very important, of what Plato would describe as the true, the good, and the beautiful. We are still in Plato's cave, but we now simply call it cybernetic echo chamber. 2 tendencies are important for capturing today's cybernetic logic. And that is the logic of Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, etc. First, as Zuckerberg himself summarized in his recent Facebook manifesto, we are talking about a short-form medium where resonant messages get amplified many times. This rewards simplicity and discourages nuance. End of quote. It was a rare lucid moment, followed by the usual ideological lingo. Second, as media theorist Van Dijk observed, Facebook's like button reveals, quote, an ideological predilection. It favors instant, gut-fired, emotional, positive, and by implication negative evaluations. This applies to the entire ecosystem of websites, platforms, and applications in which winners and losers are identified by means of thumbs, hearts, and balls, and according to the popularity principle. So when it comes to opinions and opinions on opinions, social media have very low entry barriers and very low transaction costs. And together, these tendencies ensure that online culture too often simply generates cheap talk, as Ray Fishman from Columbia Business School called it. And it is precisely such cheap talk that prices the professional expert, be it a journalist, scientist, or critic, out of the market and drowns their voices in the attention economy. Many evangelists from Silicon Valley would claim, based on the Californian ideology, the dominant ideology of the tech region, that this is a good thing. In the Californian ideology, three apparently opposing ideological blocks come together in a more or less happy marriage. The ideas about cybernetics from the 40s and 50s, the hippie communes of the 60s and 70s, and the neoliberal investors of the 80s and 90s. These groups find each other in the belief that non-hierarchical, horizontal interactions between equal and autonomous actors, that is, peers, such as will always result via feedback loops in dynamic networks that tend towards a harmonious optimum. The true, the good, and the beautiful. And this goes for information systems, communities, markets, name it. In other words, all of these comment section and reaction fields, thumbs and hearts, stars and balls are part of an ideological apparatus in which we are pre-programmed to constantly give feedback to this dynamic network. And in theory, this should lead to a harmonious optimum. I say in theory because this should mean that the continuous stream of opinions and ratings should foreground the best of all possible journalistic or scientific truths, aspirational and just behavior, or interesting artistic and cultural expressions. That has not happened. In its stead, we got Trump. The problem here is not so much that no distinction is made between feedback consisting of fact-free cheap talk and an informed opinion that is, say, truthful. The problem is that in the Californian ideology, this distinction is by definition unimportant and even unwanted and undesired. On the free market of expression, everyone is equal. For hippies, because democratization involves the promise of non-hierarchical diversity. For venture capitalists, because consumer preferences are supposed to guide the invisible hand of the market. And for cyber gurus, because it embodies the wisdom of the crowd. And so the threshold for expressing opinions must be kept as low as possible. This has all led to a crumbling of hierarchy and expertise, as journalist Susan Moore described it in The Guardian. A striking illustration of this cybernetic logic is Netflix's recent move from a rating method based on a comment section linked to stars from 1 to 5, to a review system with a binary choice between like and dislike. The old method resembled the way a critic reaches a substantiated value judgment. The new system mobilizes quick judgments based on gut feelings, taste, and preference. The reason for this change? Too many reviewers provided proper, informed argumentation for their ratings, because they were reviewing for others, an audience. And, as a Netflix spokesperson explained, that cannot be the goal of reviewing. 5 stars feels very yesterday now, he said. The reason for introducing the new review system was, in other words, to generate more ratings, more feedback, so that Netflix algorithms can become even better in personalizing suggestions based on what I like. It illustrates that the democratization of value judgments linked to the free market of expression leads to a consumer logic whereby truth, justice, and beauty are translated into what feels good, feels true, or feels beautiful for you and yours. It results in echo chambers constructed by algorithms, in which we are only presented with that what is easy to digest because our guts are already used to the taste of it. All this creates a paradoxical situation. The increased diversity of viewpoints leads to a singular experience of the world, and the democratization of the value judgment leads to the tyranny of the popular. This has resulted, as Daniel Mendelssohn described it in his Critics Manifesto for The New Yorker, in a world with a lot of heat, but not a lot of light. Populism and polarization befalls us. 2. Covfefe presupposes that game masters are untrustworthy. So I'm now going to stop reading and move to free associations. So we talk about a fictional world that not only has an environment that can be gamed, it has a game environment, you could say. As Trump said in a recent documentary on Netflix, it was footage from the 80s, his first appearance on cable news or the cable television in the States. He was asked about his view of life, and he said, "I do understand it is all basically a game. We are all here to play the game, and we are all hopefully going to play it well, but some people obviously can't play." So Trump sees the whole world as a game. And the first rule of this game is that nobody can be trusted. Nobody should be trusted. And first and foremost, that goes for the mainstream media, liberal politics, all the sort of, so what we're seeing now, sort of the end of the liberal consensus and its institutions, or at least these institutions and this consensus are under threat or even discarded in this fictional world. And that is probably because we are in a moment in time when the promises of this liberal consensus, namely economic growth, eternal economic growth, trickle-down economics, multicultural ideal of frictionless societies, these promises have not been sort of kept. So trust in those older institutions is on the wane, and that is perfect for somebody like Trump, because the first rule of the game is do not trust anybody. So you saw that, for instance, how that is sort of becoming so widespread with the recent video, the recent Sinclair broadcast, right? Where the newsreaders were all saying, everything is fake news except us, trust us. So that's a local news network, and all the anchors started with the exact same script, saying, all news is fake news, but you can have confidence in us. And of course, Sinclair is sponsored by very right-wing conservative people owned as well. So there's a bit of irony, but I was really sort of scared, I got scared by the recent poll of Monmouth University this week. And the poll actually showed that more than 3 in 4 Americans actually believe, so that's 77%, that traditional major TV and newspaper media outlets report fake news. So who can still be trusted? Apparently, we can't trust anybody. It is then ironic that the followers of Trump have chosen somebody in which they should be able to trust because it's their elected leader, etc., that is incredibly untrustworthy himself. What is interesting when you look at sort of the public statements of Trump, often through Twitter, is that he says something, and that always leads to 2 sort of reactions. Either he revokes it or changes it a few days later, or you see that all the journalists, even his own advisors, are sort of scrambling together in order to make sense of what he actually said. And of this last thing, there was a great example this week. He wants to pull out and bring back all the troops from Syria and send them to the border to guard the border. Interestingly, his own advisors then struggled to explain this. And what they came up with is, yeah, of course, he said he's going to bring back the troops from Syria, but only if Islamic State is being destroyed. And that is sort of an open end, right? That's when that is sort of whenever Trump himself decides that they are destroyed. The second thing is this patrolling the border. It is not allowed, of course, to let soldiers, to employ soldiers on American soil. So it's even impossible. So what did his advisors do? He said, yeah, well, this is not exactly what he meant. He probably meant the National Reserves, right? Instead of soldiers. So what he's always doing is articulating something that seems very clear, but is actually entirely unclear and untrustworthy, and then the entourage is sort of helping out to sort of make sense or revoking or changing, again, what is happening there. So of all the people that in this fictional universe have some kind of clout, the one with the biggest clout, Trump, is the one who is the most untrustworthy. On the other hand, and that's the second interesting point, the second interesting point made by Akker and Timotheus in Vice magazine a couple of weeks ago, is that he uses this sort of inconsistency also to sort of feel out what is successful and what is not successful with the crowd, right? The mathematician Katie O'Neill observed, for instance, that he acts like a perfectly opportunistic algorithm, following audience reactions and then adjusting his message to it. So it is not just that he is doing this because he has no idea what he's doing. Actually, it's a conscious strategy to be untrustworthy in order to be able to sort of always be the most popular kid on the block. Always be the one who is not boring, but always exciting that people talk about. Okay. 3. Covfefe assumes that the rules of the game can be changed at the player's convenience. If you go briefly back to the tweet and slightly reread it, and reread it in the following way, despite the constant negative press, Covfefe. This is actually a strategy, a narrative strategy, and the structure of the way he formulates and the structure of a syntax. What he is constantly doing, and that's why we should take the tweet very seriously, he always sort of describes something, puts it aside, and then inserts his own version of this particular event, right? So what he's doing constantly is negating, postulating, negating one reality and postulating something that becomes an axiom of a fictional world in which Covfefe is a normal word. He did not invent this. Actually, this has been going on for 10 years in the alt-right blogosphere. For my research, I did research with a student of mine on Breitbart and Geen Stijl, a Dutch weblog, similar weblog, of 15,000 articles from 2007 to 2017 on these two blogs. And we did a critical discourse analysis. We looked at levels of vocabulary, grammar, formal conventions, and format. And what you see happening there is exactly the same thing as what Trump is doing now. So when he was elected, he was actually the product, you could say, of precisely this way of speaking in the alt-right blogosphere. I was just going to read the results. We found that Breitbart and Geen Stijl ultimately share a distinctive trait that we have come to call the new anti-intellectual intellectualism, a pervasive tendency across the alt-right blogosphere that can be observed in both the form of the content and the content of the form. These kind of blogs see themselves as home of a new class of intellectuals. Intellectuals whom have taken the proverbial red pill that see right through the bullshit of the intellectuals of the liberal elite. As form of the content, that is, form that is determined by the anti-intellectual content of alt-right blogs, Geen Stijl and Breitbart employ highly specific formal conventions. We observed 4 generic traits. 1. The collapse of the critical distance between objective author and perceived reality. Articles are always explicitly based on the personal experiences of the author. 2. The collapse of the distinction between author and audience. Authors continuously refer to an exophoric we, of which it is a priori assumed that both writer and audience are included. 3. Essentialism, based on universal and dichotomous categories, us versus them, liberals versus conservatives, urban versus rural, etc. And 4. Resentment, based on a perceived injustice against the in-group of author and audience as a discursive engine. So as content of this form, so that is a content that is determined by the medium specificity of intellectual blocks, Geen Stijl and Breitbart set out from, and then reframe, the truth claims of what they variously describe as liberal leftist elites, working in universities and the media, what is true, as well as politics and civil society, what is right. One standout finding is a continuous mixing of passive and active voice that mixes news and opinion, or more frequently presents news as opinion. So, much like Trump does, they negate one thing and then postulate something else in order to enter a fictional world with its own highly specific axiomas. In doing so, they discursively produce alternative truths that supposedly expose and then rectify the truth claims of the so-called dominant intellectual class. Their anti-intellectualism can be observed in the dominant practice of hyperlinking to, say, news reports, academic research, political programs and policy proposals in order to respond to them and then override them with their own propositions. So the resulting alternative truth claims pertaining to the categories of our research, and those categories were liberalism, mainstream media, and political correctness. Those were the keywords that we used to come up with the population. Include but are not limited to a collective judgment of academics, journalists, and progressive, more broadly, as patronizing and dangerous. A description of the blog's writers and audience as the new intellectual class, and a conviction that they live in and see the real world, the world as it actually is. And of course they do. It is the real world for them. Okay.
Yes, which leads us to thesis 4. Covfefe implies that our world is a possible world, or rather still is all at once many possible worlds, many of which are in fact impossible, though not at all in fiction. So if every proposition, as philosophers say, implies and requires a particular world in which that proposition is either true or false, so for example, if I would say, I'm wearing a blue sweater, I may well be referring to this world. If I would say, I think I might be wearing a red sweater in 10 minutes, I mean, that would be a possibility. I'm referring to a possible world, a world that may well be true in 10 minutes, although it is not actual at this very moment. And so a possible world is a world that is implied by the statement. Every statement implies a world. Every game, and we're talking, I guess, about games here, every game also implies a particular universe, a particular world. If two kids, and this is from Kendall Walton, if two kids are playing a game in a sandbox in which they pretend that their sand and the little stuff, the toys that they have are an oven and they're baking cookies, then they are playing a game in which sand stands in for dough and maybe water comes to stand in for milk or eggs, and the toys that they have stand in for an oven or whatever. Then they're isomorphically pretending that all these different items also have another life, you may say, also have a possible life other than the one that we see with the register that we are trained in, with the register at hand, the register of science, the register of, I don't know, and so on and so forth. So in a different register, Walton says, in a possible world, these things have different meanings. And so some of the stuff that we have around us, like this table and these glasses, have a direct correlate in this possible world. But of course, there's also stuff that doesn't have a direct correlate. So maybe I would say, I was sitting here and then a dragon came to bite my head off, right? And so the dragon is not isomorphic. The dragon doesn't come from anywhere here. It comes from somewhere else. I'm adding it, as it were. But every single statement and every single game, however normal or however crazy, however common or however rare, implies a particular universe, implies a particular world. And so, the quote, maybe, I think so. Yes, let's go on. The quote despite the negative press, which is one world, Covfefe, 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 there's another world, right? We have one world and we have another one at the same moment. and I don't know how to pronounce this, obviously, which I think makes it all the better. We have the postulation of a world. And so I think it's important, oh dear, I think it's important to just briefly understand what a possible world is and how fictional worlds, the worlds that are postulated by novels and by films, by those texts that make no claim to a truth. Indeed, some philosophers, like Helen Friend, has said that every text is fictional as long as its claim is not a truth claim, or that at least every text can be fictional as long as its claim is not a truth claim. They are similar but different. So a possible world, Thomas Pavel, who's one of the key figures here, writes, a possible world defines a way things could have been, a possible state of affairs of some kind. And so Pavel has these two wonderful examples. Julius Caesar dies as a result of wounds inflicted by conspirators. That would be the real world. And then he says, it is possible, it's completely conceivable that Julius Caesar would have survived this attack on his life. It's a possible world. It's a very feasible, possible world. A fictional world, and I'm basing this on Weihinger, who is the crazy person who started writing about stuff as fiction in the early 20th century. A fictional world is a comparative apperception with a non-reality. That is to say, a possible world is also a fictional world, but a fictional world is not necessarily a possible world, because the stuff that's happening doesn't necessarily need to be possible. And so, as Pavel writes, if I would write, Julius Caesar lives to become, he survives the attack, and then becomes 2,000 years old, this is obviously not a possible world in the same sense that the other one is. Because according to the natural laws of our universe, this doesn't belong to the same realm. A different possible world with very different kinds of rules. So it's a possible world, but with a twist, you may say. And the same, Pavel writes, if Julius Caesar squares the circle. Different game. It's an unreality, something that not just hasn't happened, but something that according to the laws of this particular world cannot happen. Okay, and so I think that the relationship, or the thing is that the first would be a what if, what Ulrich Beck famously calls the risk society, right? You map all through algorithms, all the possible routes a particular thing could take, a particular development could take, like Shell does, or every single risk insurer, all the ways you could die. And then the fiction is a postulation. This is a dragon. This is a talking teapot. This is Covfefe, right? It's a completely different logic altogether. And so these two work together, and yet they're similar. I think can we go on to the next? And just to make it a bit clearer, I don't know if this will make it a bit clearer, but it may well. So if this is the real world, this is the possible real world, one, another development, another. And here you might say we go into fictional development. So, if we could say the possible world one, it is possible that Covfefe refers to sexual mojo. Right? So, despite the negative press, I'm an animal in the sack. Right? Could be. We don't know. I think it could really mean this, actually. The second possible world, which would be here, so another development within that scenario, it's equally feasible that this mojo is due to a sensitivity to others. Donald Trump has a great sensitivity for all the other beings in this world. Men, women, animals, things. He really cares, and he understands them. Right? So, I mean, I don't believe it, but it's feasible. It could be a case, especially if he's such an animal in the sack, then maybe that is because he really feels the bodies of other people. But then, if we would say among these others are five-headed, fire-spewing dragons, I think we're going somewhere else. So we're not, in a way, within the same ontological laws. We're moving elsewhere. Still a possible world, to be sure, but a possible world of a different category, you might say. A fictional category, an unreality. And then if we take that further, these dragons hail from one of the 27 planets in our Milky Way. We don't have 27 planets as far as we know in our Milky Way. We're moving again, right? If we would have said these dragons are attractive, then we would still be in this world, right? That would be a property maybe of the dragons. But if you would say they hail from one of 27 planets, we're adding another fictional layer as if it were. So, Covfefe, I think, could open up this, and it could well open up this. And so here we're beginning to think in terms of fictional worlds. And this is, I think, where it gets interesting. Because although Covfefe, as Robin also said, doesn't refer to something in our language, I think is there another one, a previous one? Sorry. Although it doesn't refer to a word in our language, in our world, it may indeed well refer to something real, true, whatever, factual, in a possible universe, in a possible world, in a fictional world. It may well have a meaning. And indeed, I think part of why this was so funny, Covfefe the strong and the wizard Covfefe and Covfefe the strong, is that we see here the creation of those universes. The word is postulated, and then the comments begin. And even, of course, serious papers like The Guardian do this. And they call it interpretation, but I think we should call this what it is, right? Fan fiction. This is what fan fiction is about. If The Guardian or the New York Times begin to try and interpret Covfefe, yes, sorry, I should stay seated. I'm going to read also. Maybe I should read something. I wrote something about this. Okay, so to treat our world as if it were fictional, which is to say to treat all or some of its properties as a something that they are not, at least not in the context of the epistemic systems that we tend to use, this has at least three implications. The first is that our world can only be accessed through the story or narratorial position that determines the fictional parameters. In this example, the tweet, despite the negative press Covfefe, and more generally the mind and body of Donald Trump. The second implication, so the first is about access. The second is that our world is incomplete, since fictional worlds cannot, as a rule, be complete. Indeed, fictional worlds always necessarily have, as the literary scholar Ruth Ronan puts it, spots of indeterminacy. There is stuff in fictional worlds that is unknowable. We don't know, and we cannot know, for instance, as the philosopher Gregory Curry writes somewhere, how many hairs Sherlock Holmes has. Most of these spots of indeterminacy are incidental. To paraphrase the film scholar V.F. Perkins, no story would ever get going if it had to itemize all of the world's items. But there are spots of indeterminacy that are purposeful, of course, that add drama or ambiguity, gaps that matter precisely because they are gaps. And recent studies, and this is, I should have done this earlier, recent studies of transmedia storytelling suggest, moreover, that text expressly create gaps so that fans can fill them in their e-books and their blogs. And in this sense, I will be inclined to suggest that Trump's lack of elaboration on Covfefe, and more generally the decontextualized, obscured, and uneven nature of his statements on Twitter and elsewhere, affects less interpretations than fan fictions, in which the contours of the fictional world are being drawn in increasing detail. And so this goes for hilarious intervention on social media as much as the more serious commentaries in quality newspapers like The Guardian. And of course it's interesting here with these speculations that really contribute to the creation of those fictional universes, to those fictional universes that will determine how we think about stuff around us, that they are deleted the moment they're no longer useful, right? So you get the creation of loads of speculative moments, The Guardian, New York Times, what could it mean, what could it mean, what could it mean? And then the moment it's no longer interesting, or the moment it's proven untrue, these pages are removed. And I think this is something that makes sense, and at the same time is quite interesting, that part of the culture, in this case of outrage that's created, is deleted after the fact. Anyways, and in this manner, I think in a manner that the shorter and more confusing the statements of fiction, the more extensive and elaborate the immersive response. And then finally, fictional worlds can be incoherent. Contradictory natural laws may well exist in sci-fi novels or fantasy films. As Pavel puts it, someone can live to 2,000 years old or can square a circle. And I think, it is important, right, that although I'm sure, it was a typo, that Trump then intervenes and writes, who can figure out the true meaning of Covfefe? Like J.K. Rowling saying, I really wonder what happens to Harry Potter and this girl in this book, right? All these fan fiction writers are doing a really great job. Or the Twilight author writing to this, what is E.L. James? Great, what a sexy game you've made of this. I don't know, right? But it's interesting that he engages with his fan fiction, like an author would, in a way. So, 5. Covfefe decontextualizes, and maybe I should say, has a particular depth of field, has a very limited depth of field, a very shallow or small depth of field. So this is the next picture. This is a very famous picture in fictional world theory, and I'm sure that all of you know it. It's by Goya. And Kendall Walton, in his wonderful book on mimesis, uses this picture famously to show that fictional worlds always exist in an interaction, in a tension between the in the frame or the inside the story and what is not being told but what we have to assume. And so, for example, here it's obvious that these people are afraid and are suffering. Yeah, it's an amazingly, tremendously terrifying image. And they are afraid not because there are some spears hanging midair, Kendall Walton writes. Right? The fear of these people is not because they're hanging midair, it's because there is, some real nasty dudes behind this, holding those spears, holding those bayonets on their guns, about to slaughter them. Right? So Walton says that this, of course, infers that the world is bigger than what we see, and it is precisely the fact that they're cut off that implies this world. And so, in terms of what is visible and invisible, or shown and not shown, or talked about explicitly and not, the world is created in this tension, in this dialectic. And films and shows play with this. Of course, they play with this all the time. They played a lot with this in the 1980s and 90s. And so I'm going to talk a bit about Pleasantville. I don't know if anyone here has seen the film. Ironically, I think, because Pleasantville was written by Gary Ross and directed by Gary Ross, who was one of Clinton's speech writers. And so the story of the film opposes that of Trump, and yet at the same time, I think they are surprisingly similar. I doubt there are many viewers, even those who consider themselves seasoned film buffs, who are struck by the game that Pleasantville plays with style and meaning, with how and what, particularly in terms of genre. Indeed, most scholarly accounts of the film make mention of this play. A film that crosses more genres than I can recount here, including, but not limited to, the 1950s sitcom, the small-town film, film noir, melodrama, the nouvelle vague, the 1980s blockbusters, and 1990s teen cinema, MTV teen cinema. Its gimmick is to treat generic visual tropes as if they are intrinsically linked to ontological predispositions. So, for instance, and the film is about two teenagers who are zapped into a 1950s sitcom. Because 1950s sitcoms never showed any blood, or anyone going to the toilet, or sex, and the reason being, of course, that these were all censored until the 1960s. The Hollywood Code said explicitly that no bodily fluids could be shown. This is taken to mean in the film that the sitcom's fictional universe, the fictional world, was a world without blood, or without toilets, or without sex. There's a striking scene early on in the film when one of the characters, Reese Witherspoon, enters the toilet cubicle to find, to her surprise as much as ours, that it is empty. Or if a small-town film was set, presumably due to budgetary constraints, only in Main Street, this is taken to mean here that there is only one Main Street, that the world consists exclusively of this single street, looping from back to front. Indeed, Pleasantville goes as far as in its conceit to suggest that all of the 1950s fictional worlds are black and white. When protagonists David and his sister Jennifer, so Tobey Maguire and Reese Witherspoon, are zapped into the sitcom, the premise of the film, she remarks disgustedly, "I'm pasty." Pleasantville introduces these conceits, and this is where I get to Covfefe, whatever. Pleasantville introduces these conceits. It gives the viewers a heads up, if you will, straight from the get-go. So its opening scene, which is what I briefly want to mention, depicts what seems like an exchange between David, this dude, and an unnamed girl, played by Heather McGill, from his school. Cutting back and forth between isolated medium close-ups of David and the girl, each of them set against a distinctly out-of-focus background, the film suggests that the two are talking to one another. David asks to go out with him. She nods shyly, he smiles surprisedly, sweetly, she laughs, and so on. However, at the end of the exchange, the camera pulls back to reveal, now in deep focus, that the two are at different ends of the schoolyard. They are both physically and socially worlds apart. But playing with the conventions of cinema, in particular editing, shot type, the medium close-up, and focal length or depth of field, where the background is blurred, the film momentarily causes the viewer to believe in one scenario set in one world, only to then have us discover that we are, in fact, looking at another scenario in another world. In the first, David is a heartthrob. In the second, he's a nutter. I think, in a way. Or at least, he's a very sad, lonely young man. In the former, David and the girl are within touching distance. In the latter, they aren't even close. The message, of course, of the film is clear. The stylistic register determines the parameters of the world. The axis goes through this, and the stylistic parameters determine the parameters of the world. Style is not just a vehicle for narrative, not just simply a shipment container or envelope delivering separate, or in any case separable contents. It is part and parcel of the story being told here. An audiovisual unfolding at once drawn from, parts of, and circumscribing in its entirety the film's fictional universe. Every statement changes the world. In this case, the first statement, the medium close-up, blurred background, eyeline match, cutting between David and the girl, creates one world, but it creates it, as the soft focus suggests, from a world that is always already present, but it is decontextualized. So what we see here, separating the face from the bodily and environmental locality, decontextualizes this interaction to the extent that it creates a different world within and at the same time as this other world is presumably going on. Covfefe. You create a decontextualized word against a soft focus or almost non-existing background that you allow people to work with, that you allow people to try and figure out, trying to see what this soft focus background may well or may not, I don't know where we are, yeah, may well or may not represent in order to create new meanings, a new world from this one. 6. Covfefe cuts. Okay, I'll read a bit now. This is about The Keepers. I don't know if anyone's seen The Keepers. I think it's a very tricky true crime show, and I want to say a few words about it. And it relates to Covfefe, though, like Pleasantville, in a sideways way. The Keepers, a 2017 true crime documentary directed by Ryan White and distributed in most regions through Netflix, is an example of a particular variety of Covfefe, you might say. I'll show you the trailer, I think. Before we do this, I want to show you the trailer. Yes. Shall we? Oh, there it is.
Baltimore has always been a quintessentially Catholic city.
The priests were the authority. Whatever they told you to do, you did.
The city has its level of corruption. Sister Kathy exemplified this spirit of compassion and kindness.
I have never had a teacher like that before.
She was murdered our senior year, and it's always haunted many people in the community.
Our mission, we were driven to find out who hurt Sister Kathy.
People pop up from 45, 50 years ago who say, I have a story I'd like to tell you.
I believe Kathy Sesnick was killed because she was going to talk about what went on at Keogh.
There's an on-the-record public story of what happened to Sister Kathy, and then there's the world beneath.
The police department and the state could provide protection for the priests.
There were other people brought in, local business owners, politicians that were part of this network.
I can testify that over 100 victims have been abused.
Time is getting short for us to be able to figure out what happened to Kathy.
My father said to my mother, "You want to know why I drink? Because we killed a woman and we put her behind the shop."
He said, "You see what happens when you say bad things about people?"
This goes bigger and deeper than we can imagine. The story is not the nuns killing. The story is the cover-up of the nun story.
So, The Keepers purports to document a group of brave elderly women trying to solve a murder of one of their beloved teachers, Sister Kathy, in their Roman Catholic high school decades ago. And I mean, I'm not taking issue with, I think these women are immensely brave. So this is not what I'm going to talk about. As the account progresses, more and more salient details come into view, some of which momentarily and some of which protectedly take center stage. One such terrible, tragic detail that is increasingly foregrounded is that many of the women were abused as minors at school. Among the reasons this aspect becomes important in this context is that the murdered teacher was informed of this crime and by some accounts set on confronting the perpetrator. Another teacher, a priest. All these priests always going on. Other details that take on significance are this priest's alleged friendship with and the participation in the abuse of other teachers and priests, of police officers, and of other people in power, including politicians, as well as apparent cover-ups by the local church councils and the archdiocese, apparent intentional negligence on behalf of the prosecution, and competing and inconsistent accounts by some of the key witnesses. I use the words purports and alleged and apparent deliberately because, as many of the series reviews noted, mostly approvingly, the series doesn't conclude by definitively indicting one person as the perpetrator. It is true, here it differs ever so slightly from popular contemporaries like Making of a Murderer and especially, I would guess, Serial. But I would personally be very, very hesitant to celebrate this, since as a consequence, all the suggestions raised throughout the show, all the implications remain unresolved. No one is accused, but every single person, real persons like all of us, are made to look guilty. Indeed, as the trailer, and that's why I showed it, suggests, and as is evident in the series as a whole, the series takes as its model for storytelling less investigative journalism than detective fiction, less the oeuvre of Errol Morris or even Ken Burns than of Agatha Christie or The Killing Guy. The narrative is set up as a whodunit, suspensefully circling outwards from the dead body to the detective, to the personal troubles of the detective, to the powerful players attempting to manipulate and or obstruct the investigations, through the various suspects who are all shown to be untrustworthy and each of which may or may not have been involved. You know, it's like Inspector Morse or something. This sense of suspense and revelation is mirrored in the cinematography. To give you one example that I think is apparent in the trailer as well, there are almost no static shots in the entire series. Even shots of landscapes, of crime scenes, photographs and books move. I mean, I've tried to, it's not working entirely, but I've tried to, I mean, you see the bit, right? You see a bit of the, I mean, so there is a lot of moving going on. We're zooming in on Sister Kathy. Oh dear, this is the next one. We're zooming in on Sister Kathy. Zooming in search of hidden details or zooming out to look for missing context. Slowly panning up to reveal a prop, swiping left to expose archive materials. And one of the most obvious narrative devices is the use of handheld cameras as if to sneak up on persons the documentarian has in fact already talked to minutes earlier. In one shot that features in the trailer as well, the camera jerks left and right so as to find the right frame for its subject, or indeed suspect, who not only is aware of the documentarian's presence, but standing still. So right, we have this guy out of focus, and then the camera begins really to try and capture this dude who knows the camera is there and is standing entirely still. It's not something new, right? I'm not saying this is a new way of doing this, but I think it's interesting. So in the suspect, the unevenly wrecking focus to in an apparent attempt to capture this man's facial features. And this is but one of the many such fictional indices, not to mention the many intertextual references to fictional accounts, ranging from Angels and Demons to House of Cards to All the President's Men. Indeed, what increasingly becomes obvious as The Keepers progresses, and what legal scholar Megan Boersma has observed in Making of a Murder and Serial, is that in lieu of legally admissible evidence as to the murder of Sister Kathy or the alleged cover-ups and negligence, these fictional devices take on the role of prosecution, for whom doubts are not less convincing than facts. Concerns are voiced but never addressed again. Allegations are made but not resolved. As the camera zooms out or pans down, there's always the sense that there is more to be revealed, that there are truths still to be uncovered. Never that there isn't anything there. And to be sure, I'm not saying that these documentary makers are bad people or that these women, which I think, they're obviously onto something. That's not my stake, right? The stake is that fictional means are being used to come to a particular telling of the truth. I am reminded here of a remark by the French philosopher Jean-Marie Schaeffer some decades ago, 1999, with respect to someone who is caught in a lie. And Schaeffer writes, and I quote, "A repeal is not equivalent to a cancellation. The hardest challenge is not to make believe the reality of fictional entities, but to reduce to fictional status entities that have been introduced as real," end quote. As I've mentioned earlier, two of the distinctions that possible world theorists make between actual worlds and fictional worlds is that the latter are neither necessarily coherent nor are they ever complete. The conceit of the keepers is to treat the actual world according to the criteria of the fictional one. Through its interplay between setups that aren't resolved and cinematographic devices of suspense, it opens up spots of indeterminacy within our usual models of measuring the world. Science, for instance, or the law. Occasionally, it forecloses them imperceptibly. The assumption here, after all, is not just that the police and the legal system are untrustworthy, but that filmmakers with no investigative expertise can make more honest and more accurate assessments. As a historian at a symposium on Holocaust memoirs noted a while back where I was present, with respect to Wilkimirsky's famous memoir, come novel, Fragments, this is a reconsideration of how reality can be approximated beyond the tested, but for some, and I guess this is correct also, limiting parameters of the fact. And I don't think one would be mistaken to argue that this is reminiscent of propaganda, but there is a telling difference here. Propaganda propagates to our reality an alternative, preferable world. The keepers, and I would imagine to an extent Covfefe, suggest that it is our very reality itself that is different. A reality that is open to loads of imperceptible and more perceptible gaps, hiatuses, spots of indeterminacy, and a reality that is always already incoherent. Chaotic, I think Donald Trump would say. I'm sure I should say something more, but I think that's... that's it.
Okay, 7. Covfefe has a beginning, a middle, and an end, but not necessarily in that order. In Ben Lerner's autofictional novel 1004, The World is So Unhinged, it is always unseasonably warm, for instance, that most characters are forced to adjust their personal narrative to the extent that for them, as the refrain goes, the fiction of the world is rearranging itself. The novel is set in a New York in which what previously discreetly remained in the background as system world increasingly manifests itself in the foreground, in the live world. We write 2011, and the narrative arc leads from Superstorm Irene to Superstorm Sandy via Occupy Wall Street. As James Pulford wrote in an excellent review, time is not sequential in 1004, a point illustrated most obviously by the book's form. Far from providing harmony or imposing order on time, the 5 chapters, each with several scenes, frustrate the internal chronology. Within the scenes themselves, time is on the slide, the past shunted into the present, the future hurling backwards. Moments of this kind string 1004 together, creating a sense that the past and future are fictions of the present. There is a remarkable parallelism with the ways in which the largest fiction that mankind can tell him or herself, namely history with a capital A, there's a remarkable parallelism with the change in that fiction since 2011 that we have been seeing. Since 2011, a lot of commentators, both from the left and the right of the political spectrum, so people like Kagan or Krauthammer, right conservative pundits, but also Badiou and Seamus Milne, the latter one is advisor of Corbyn, for instance. They all have said that we have seen the return of history, the revenge of history, the comeback of history, etc. Right? So that is a move away from the broadly accepted notion up until the end of the 90s that we were at the end of history. Now these kind of narratives, and in this case the largest narrative that we can tell ourselves about our place in time, point to specific forms of historicity, to specific regimes of historicity, as Hartog, the French cultural philosopher, called it. What is a regime of historicity? It is the way that we present ourselves as being in time, as having a certain relationship with the past, the present, and the future. Well, in modern times, that regime of historicity was futuristic, right? It was, the narrative structure was futurism. In postmodern times, as is well known, and the end of history is sort of the ideological cipher for that, but the work of Hamilton is clearly illustrating this already in the late 50s, the regime of historicity is presentism. It is an eternal now, right? There is no relation at all to a past and a future. Now, today's regime of historicity, after the end of history, has a very different way of presenting ourselves in time. And interestingly enough, there is a certain parallelism between the way Ben Lerner, for instance, in the title already he alludes to Back to the Future. 10:04 is the moment in the film Back to the Future when the clock sort of stops. There's a certain parallelism with how Trump, the alt-right, is describing themselves as being in history. So apparently this is sort of hanging in the air. You also see it on the left, but let's go back to Trump and his fictional universe. So in this fictional universe, you see actually that the relationship between past, present, and future is sort of formed by positing some kind of future or possible futuricity by moving back in time, right? By relating once more to the past. So instead of an eternal now, you now have the movement past, inform now, possible futuricity. You see that, for instance, in the slogan already, Make America Great Again. But you also see that in the alt-right, for instance, with the famous meme of Pepper the Frog, right? What is that meme? It is a meme that is at the center of what the alt-right calls Kekistan, the cult of Kek, in which they blend the Greek deity Kek, right? Old Egyptian god, sorry, and all kinds of Nazi rhetoric, right? So that is sort of going back in time, relating once more to the past in search of something that can provide some kind of input for an alternative universe. You also see that, for instance, in all the critique of postmodernism in the alt-right, right? Jordan Peterson that rails always against the so-called postmodern cultural Marxist and that kind of bullshit. In Holland, we have a new kid on the block, alt-right politician who is now entering parliament, and he had a beautiful quote: 50 years ago, the world was still beautiful, meaning 1968, before the 60s sort of morphed slowly into postmodern years. On the left, you see something similar, by the way, right? You see Corbyn and Sanders, sort of old-school social democrats that have been saying the same thing since the 70s, all of a sudden becoming enormously popular because they offer some kind of hope with very old-fashioned language about another possible future. So the form of historicity that we see today, and which is completely different than the futurism or the presentism of past regimes, is that in this fictional universe, you sort of try to walk through a back door in order to walk through the front door, right? So whereas the moderns opened the front door and walked into a future ville radieuse, and the postmoderns sort of did some kind of interior decoration while the past slowly receded in the background, and there was no sense at all of futuricity. Here you have this kind of hyper weird movement in which the past all of a sudden is sort of searched again, sort of rummaging through the dustbin and the garbage heap of history in order to find some kind of elements that could inform some kind of futuricity, right? As if we are in a M.C. Escher drawing. Okay. 8.
Yes, so this is the last one. I mean, as you'll have noticed, so we don't obviously have a coherent narrative about Covfefe or definitely not the broader scope. But I do think it's important that we begin to try and map out, and I think that's what we're trying to begin to do here, to map out some of these statements in fictional terms. That is by reference to fictional, right? If we assume that all these things are fictional anyways, I think it may be useful to actually look at what fictional theorists have been writing about for decades, to begin to take at hand some of their methods. Instead of constantly just bashing this philosopher or this, I mean, Kant, of course, really has been everyone has been hating him. I really love Kant's philosophy. But anyways, right, so instead of just doing that and making the simple gesture, I think it's very important that we begin to look at fictional theorists. Right, people like Peterson well, anyways, I don't even want to talk about that, or the sort of lazy cultural studies, but I think it's important that we begin to look at the concepts and the tropes and the narratives that have been developed for years. And so we've tried in a very haphazard and uneven way to do that. That said, we have a grand statement at the end, which is the following, and I don't know how well it will stand the test of time, but this is it. The second society. So if we're talking about Covfefe as a game, I think we would call this game the second society. It is in this context, finally, that we would like to suggest the concept of the second society as the designation for this particular gameplay. This notion attends to both the development's social and ontological dimensions. Indeed, the concept of the second society designates both. Its double reference can be explained to a considerable extent by its etymology. The term second society is derived in part from Wilhelm Heidmayer's very problematic phrase, the parallel society, Parallelgesellschaft, and in part from Erik Voegelin's equally incredibly problematic notion of the second reality. Right? So we're taking two concepts from two philosophers, or, well, Heidmayer is definitely not a philosopher, or so, I don't know, like a polemicist and a philosopher who we don't necessarily agree with, right? So this is not an endorsement of their politics, but I think it's a very telling way of looking at what's happening. The former, Heidmayer's parallel society, describes a social recontextualization. Erik Voegelin's notion of the second reality denotes an ontological reorientation. Less a concept than an assessment, Heidmayer's assertion of the parallel society describes the process in which a minority organizes its community in opposition to the social contract adhered to by the majority. It's already where it gets very tricky, right? Because Heidmayer assumes some kind of monoculture. But in a sense, this process includes geographical separation, social isolation, and cultural inwardness. The minority, Heidmayer writes, distances itself from the majority culture. But in another way, the structure, rules, and institutions, care for the elderly, youth clubs, doctors, schools, mirror those that the minority distances itself from. Like others, we are incredibly skeptical of the terms political and, by all accounts, problematic argument, and reception thereof perhaps even more. What, however, is, I think, of massive interest is the suggestion that a marginal experience can exist exclusively in the simultaneous affirmation and negation of a dominant register. For how are these second societies organized? What are the imagined social order, rules, and customs? How do they pertain to the social order, rules, and customs that they allegedly take issue with? And I would imagine that from the briefest of discussions here and the weirdest of discussions here, it would appear that these configurations would differ significantly. And perhaps more important, the second in second society is a reference above all to Erik Voegelin's concept of the second reality. Voegelin co-opted the term ostensibly lightheartedly from the novels of Miguel de Cervantes, Amito van Doderer, and Robert Musil, but introduced it in its own writing to describe a very serious and actual phenomenon: the rejection, deterritorialization, and displacement of a dominant experience of reality, a first one, with a second one. The most notable example of such a transfiguration for Voegelin was Nazism. Voegelin fled Nazism, went to the States. Just, he wrote, as Don Quixote refused to apperceive windmills for what they were to his contemporaries, alienated as he felt from this modern world, treating them instead, of course, as knights that he thought he would know how to fight, so the Nazis did not accept the reality of the interbellum democracy, transfiguring the picture of a society in transition, one looking for its footing, Weimar society, into the image of a permanent standoff between races, an image of a world which they required, of course, to implement their ridiculous, terrifying, devastating, catastrophic politics. In other words, a second reality is the ideological fictionalization of a first, in which relations, attributes, and individuals are lived distinctly and expressly and purposely as what they are not. Our concise discussions of the exposure and exploitation of spots and indeterminacy, for example, in Pleasantville and The Keepers, would be an example of this. And to be sure, like Heidmeyer's assertion, Veugelin's account too could be argued to be problematic on a number of accounts. First and foremost, perhaps, his assumption that there is such a thing as a first, in his case, undiscursive and even, for Veugelin, transcendental and divine reality. But the theory offers us an insight into the manner in which genres such as Covfefe or true crime TV series, or lots, I think, of the parafictional practices in contemporary art, but also popular philosophies like speculative realism and to an extent OOO, or indeed political movements at large, transfigure what we understand reality to be. Indeed, this penultimate practice, speculative realism, assumes, of course, precisely this, that objects are or possess actuality in more senses than the one that we humans tend to recognize. We wouldn't think it is too far off the mark that a number of right-wing politicians currently gaining popularity, and of course Trump is a symptom, right? I mean, we're from Holland, we have had this kind of bullshit since the late 90s, early 2000s, right? Pim Fortuyn, Geert Wilders, it's happening all across Europe, it's happening at so many places, even in Norway where I live, this is happening apparently. That they are equally pluralist in their discourse, with the important distinction that they will value another dimension depending on the debate or the day, changing the rules of the game. A simultaneous affirmation of a relativism and a dangerous absolutism. I don't know if we want to say anything more. I mean, we've been going on for so long. Shall we just end it there? Is that fine? Yeah? Cool. Well, thank you so much. That was it.